In this video we're going to create a user interface, also known as a graphical user interface, or GUI for short. Since the GUI is what your user will interact with, it's very important to make good decisions about where you place the various controls that will comprise your forms. And so what we're going to do is not only introduce a lot of the graphical user interface components from the toolbox, but we're also going to talk about best practices. Now we're going to define only 7 best practices. There are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of things that you can do to make sure that the experience that your user has with your application is optimal. There are entire books written on this topic, and there are people that specialize just in this field alone. So what we'll be doing is a mere surface level look at some best practices when it comes to graphical user interface design. So let's go ahead and create a new project. I'll click on File, New, Project. And when the New Project dialog appears, let's select Visual Basic Projects and Windows Application. And then here we're going to type in Lesson 04. And if you're following along, you shouldn't have to change the location from C:/begin1. Let's go ahead and click OK. After a moment or two, our solution and our project will be created for us, and we'll have a blank form on our designer. What is the designer? Well, it's the surface upon which we're going to draw and lay out the location of the controls on our form. That's actually a very simplified explanation of what a designer is. There's lots of designers within VisualStudio.net. This particular one allows us to create Windows forms. The designer allows us to see visually what our forms will look like. But as I'll show you in a moment, what actually happens behind the scenes is that the designer actually produces code in the code view. And most of the time that'll be hidden from us and we won't even need to touch it, but it's there available for us if we ever need to modify it. So what we're going to do with this project is actually create a fictitious input form for customer information. And so what we'll want to do is start to place items from our toolbox onto our form designer. And to do that, all we need to do is either drag, I'm holding down my mouse button, dragging over here to the designer surface, and then dropping it into the place where I want it, in this case dropping a label onto our form. Or I can just double click, and when I look at my form, there's actually another label there. So as we take a look at our toolbox, we can see that there's a number of different items that are available to us. We can even scroll down and look. There's literally dozens of things that we can place on our forms. And there's other things that we can place on our forms that are non-visual, that are hidden behind these little toolbox grouping areas. For example, if I click the top item, notice that it slides down and I can see a lot of data components. I can select the Components subtab and look at all of the different system and file related items. And there's obviously the Windows Forms, which we'll use primarily in this video. So let's start talking about the label. The label control allows developers to describe the purpose of a given field on a form. Now when we first drag and drop a label onto our design surface, it has the wrong text and it's not named a very rememberable name. For example, the text currently says label 1. You can see that this value corresponds to what we see visually here on the designer surface. This property window allows us to change attributes about a given control. These attributes can either be in appearance or in behavior. In this case, it's appearance. So let's change this to something a little bit more meaningful. Let's change this to first name. Also, we'll want to change the actual name of our label. And to do that, we'll go to our name field down here and type in a new name. Now notice that when I change the property called name, nothing visually happened on our control. Name is a property that we'll use whenever we want to refer to this control within the code that we write in the code view. So we want to pick good names for our controls. In this case, I picked a three-letter prefix LBL, and then I mimicked the actual text of our label, first name. This lets me know that this label is for first name. It uniquely identifies it from the other label I have on the form, whose current name is label 2. They're both labels, but they're two different instances of the label. So let's go ahead and change the text of label 2 and call this gender. And then let's go ahead and name this LBL gender. Now the name might be a little bit hard for you to understand right now why we need to actually name our controls, but you'll see that this is actually a very useful technique as we start writing code. This leads us to our first two best practices. The first best practice is that you should align label text to the left and use a colon after the text. Now by default, the text does appear to the left-hand side of the label. However, we can change the text align using a different property, the text align property. We can center it, we can move it to the lower right-hand corner, or we can select it the upper left-hand corner. So as you can see, some of the properties have neat little tools that allow you to see visually what you're going to do before you actually do it, to remove any ambiguity. That's also true whenever you're dealing with things such as the font, where we can actually select different fonts. You can see an example of the font in the left-hand side here. And also it applies to whenever working with colors. For example, the for color, I drop down this list box, I can see various colors that are available to me. So the property window has built-in tools that allow us to not only type information in like we did in the text property, but also to be able to see visually what we're going to change and how it's going to affect our given control. The second best practice is that you should choose names for your controls that describe their purpose and prefix them with a three-letter abbreviation that indicates what type of control that you used. In this case, we used a label, and so we named it LBL first name and LBL gender. As we begin to put some other controls on our web forms, you're going to see that I'm going to use different prefixes for them. For example, the text box, I'll use TXT, and so on. But for now, I'm just going to add a couple more labels to my form using the same approach. The next control that we're going to use is the text box. And the text box allows user to type information into the form. Let's go ahead and set some properties of this as well. First of all, we're going to name it txt name. Notice that I use the prefix txt because it's a text box. I'm also going to remove any of the text, but before I do that, let me show you some other properties such as the text align. Here I'm going to either center or I can right align the text. And also I can change the back color, selecting from either one of three tabs the system colors according to the user's current system color selections, most popular web colors, and also any custom colors. So we can set this to like a pale orange color. And we want to remove the text box 1 because that is not necessary whenever we start up the form. This brings us to another best practice, which is you should use default colors and default fonts. It's not a good idea to get fancy, so let's go ahead and change back to the default setting, which is window. You can take an otherwise great application and make it very annoying for your users if you choose too many colors. The typical setting that you want to use on your applications is what's called battleground gray, or battleship gray rather, which is the typical dull grayish color on most forms that you see. The next control that we're going to add to our form is the radio buttons. We're going to add two of them, one for male and one for female. Radio buttons allow users to select one from a list of possible choices, and the number of options needs to be 4 or fewer. If you have more than 4, then you should probably consider either using a list box or a combo box, as we'll talk about in just a moment. Let's go ahead and change the names for these. For the radio button, we're going to use the 3-letter prefix RAD, R-A-D, and then we're either going to select male, and let's type in the value male. And let's resize this so we can fit both the male checkbox and the female one on the same line. I've moved on now to selecting the second radio button. Let's call this female, and then changing this to rad female. And let's make this smaller and place it here on this line. Now the users are required to either select male or female. If we want to default one of these to be the current selection, for example, if we want it to be by default a male, then we need to use the checked property and set it to true. If the user selects female, the male radio button will become blank and the female button will have the black circle in it. The next control that we're going to use is a list box. Let's go ahead and drag this over onto our designer surface. And we can even resize it a little bit. And list boxes allow users to select one or more items from a list. And it's supposed to be used whenever you have 5 or more options and each one can be selected. You can also have a variation on this where you make it so that only one can be selected at a time. So let's go ahead and change, first of all, the name. And we're going to use LST as our prefix, and then interested in. So this will be used in order to select which items a given customer might be interested in. And so what we'll need to do is actually add items to our list box, and we can do that using the items property. Notice when I select it, a little box appears with an ellipsis, 3 periods. So I'm going to click on that, and it's going to pop open the string collection editor. This allows us to type in all the products that we might have to sell at our company, for example. So these are items that we want to appear in our list box. You can see here that our visual designer actually shows us what it'll look like once the application is actually run. If we select selection mode, we can say either only one should be selected or allow more than one to be selected by choosing multi-simple. We'll explain multi-extended at some future point in time. For our purposes, let's select multi-simple. Let's go on to the next item from our toolbox, and let's use a drop-down list box, also known as a combo box. We'll drag it and drop it here. And combo boxes allow users to either select one item from a list or optionally type in a value that's not represented on the list. So this is to be used whenever you want to restrict the user to just one selection item or to remind them of their option. So let's go ahead and rename our combo box to CBO City. Notice that we use the three-letter prefix CBO for combo box. The next thing I'm going to do is scroll up and go to the text property. We're not going to have any selections to begin with, so let's just delete the text there. And then I do want some items to actually pop up in our the drop-down list portion. So let's go ahead and click Items. Notice that ellipsis appears. I'm going to click on that, and the string collection editor pops up, and we're going to type in a few items we want to appear in the drop-down list box. Now click OK. The cool thing about the combo box is that the user can also type in the value that they want in case they don't see any of the values in the drop-down list box. And that default setting can be changed using the drop-down style. If we were to select, for example, drop-down list, it would require them to select one of the items from the list. But in the current default mode, they can either select one from the list or type something into this area. So let's go ahead and move on. We're going to also use a checkbox control. Checkboxes allow users to select an option as a yes or no, true or false kind of question. Checkboxes can be grouped together when the number of questions are 4 or fewer in number, and where one or more of those items can be selected at a time. If there's more than 4, then you should probably use a list box. So first of all, let's go ahead and change the actual text, and we'll call it saw our ad, which allows the user to select whether the customer saw the ad or not. We can get a tally of that at some point. And let's also use our three-letter prefix for the checkbox, CHK, and then we'll call it saw our ad. Just like the radio button, we can also modify the checked property. By default, we can make it checked. Then let's go ahead and resize our form, make it a little bit longer, and we're going to add 2 more items, some buttons. And the first one we're going to call OK, and we'll name it BTN for button, OK. And then the next one we're going to name BTN cancel, and we'll also make the text say cancel. And buttons are controls that allow users to indicate that they're ready to take an action on the form. So when the user says, okay, I'm done entering my information, let's do something, they can either click OK to maybe save that information or have it validated or something, or they can click cancel and say just forget any changes that I made. But the button is what typically prompts a user to that they want to take action. So we have all of our controls here, but we're not done. We want to make some improvements to what we've done here. And the first thing that we want to do is actually highlight a best practice. We've looked at all these different kinds of controls, and we could have probably just gotten by just using text boxes. For example, in a text box, somebody could type in whether it was male or female, but what if they also typed man or woman? Or maybe they would type in I don't know. Now, computers don't work very well with those kinds of variables. We want to restrict the options to either male or female so that we get consistent data. Maybe we're saving all this information in a database. We want a consistent way so that we can group all the male records in the database versus all the female records. And if we looked at every variation and every misspelling of male and female, we wouldn't really have very good data to work with. So we always want to restrict data. And so here comes the best practice, and that is that you want to use the correct control for the kind of interactivity and the kind of data that you want to gather. So we used the list box in a different way than we used the drop-down list box, in a different way than we used the check boxes and the radio buttons. They all have a different purpose, and so it's important that you learn when it's appropriate to use certain kinds of controls. And we've highlighted some of those reasons in the course of this video. And before we go on also, we want to also highlight the fact that you should align OK and cancel buttons near the lower right hand corner of your form. If you take a look at most applications, they're going to have some variation on the OK and cancel. If you work with Microsoft Office products, which follow the standards for Windows applications as well as any other application that's on the market, you'll notice that they use OK and cancel, and that it's always in the order OK first and then cancel second. Also, they're always in the lower right hand corner. Now, there's other types of forms that might require you to put a list of controls down the right hand side, but we won't look at that just today. Like I said, there's a lot of variations on this and a lot of rules about when to do what. But in the case of a simple form like this, an OK cancel buttons work just fine. Let's take a look at one more best practice, and that is that notice how I've kept the controls and the labels aligned in imaginary columns. Now I need to straighten them out a little bit and get them aligned a little bit better here, but you should kind of think of your forms in terms of columns, and on the left hand side place the labels, and on the right hand side place the actual controls. And we've looked at the properties for each of the controls, but you might not be surprised to see that actually the form itself has a number of properties. If you select anywhere in the dotted area here, in the grid area, you'll notice that the properties for the form appear. So we can actually give this a title like Customer Information. Whoops, I spelled it wrong. And I spelled it wrong. At any rate, notice how when I click OK here, that customer information shows up in the title bar of our form. Also, we can set where the form appears on the user's screen whenever they actually run the application by setting the start position. Let's go ahead and set it on the center of our screen. We could also set it manually in an exact position, or some of the other options that are listed there. Additionally, we can determine whether our form should be resized or not by using the form border style. Currently it's sizable, but we shouldn't make it sizable if the rest of the controls are not sizable as well. So let's go ahead and just place fixed single. In a future video we'll talk about how to make your forms resizable. But before we leave, we want to talk about one more thing, and that is that you want to make your application so that it can be navigated only by the keyboard. And the way that you do that is using a tab index property. So you want to begin with the cursor to show up in first name, and then as the user uses the tab key on their keyboard, go consecutively through our controls, OK, cancel, and then back around to the first name again. And the way that we do that is by using the tab index. So let's go ahead and scroll down here. Currently this is set to 4, but it should be set to 1. We'll set this tab index to 2, this one to 3, this one to 4, this one to 5, this one to 6, this one to 7, and this one to 8. So now that we've made all of our changes here, let's go ahead and run our application. Notice that to begin with, because we set our tab stop at 1 here, that we start at the first name. Now I'm going to use the tab key on my keyboard and go to male, then to female. What? It didn't go to female? Well, the reason is because these two are seen as a group. Every radio button that you put on the form by itself is considered to be in the same group. If you want to have two different groups of radio buttons, then you'll need to use a group box control. So you may want to review that in the help. We'll go over that sometime in the future. But for right now, let's look at just how it's able to continue to tab through city, saw our ad, OK, and cancel. Additionally, whenever we click the drop down, we can see that Dallas, Mesquite, and Garland appear. I can select Garland, or I can type in Washington, D.C. Also notice that when I select female, that the circle leaves the male radio button and goes to the female, so it's selected, and vice versa. And I can select more than one item by holding down the Control key and selecting and deselecting items from the list box. So that pretty much wraps up our video, except for one thing I did want to show you, I promised to. You know, we talked about what the designer does. Well, behind the scenes, the designer is actually creating code. And to prove this, let's take a look at the code for our form. You might say to yourself, well, I really don't see anything. But notice how we jump from line 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 169. The reason is because we have a region that hides a lot of code that was created automatically by VisualStudio.net. So when we click on the plus sign and open it up, notice all this code that was developed for us by Visual Studio. So for example, let's take a look at our button OK. Remember when we created the button, this button here? When we set its properties using the property window, what actually happened behind the scenes was that it actually created a new button on the screen at a specific location. It set the name property, the tab index, and the actual text that we wanted. And the same is true for our form, for our other buttons and combo boxes and list boxes and everything. So there's a direct correlation between the designer and actually what gets outputted in code. Be sure to get some practice working with the form designer by completing the exercise in this lesson. Thank you.